There we go. I pretty much talk the same everywhere I go. Unless I'm preaching. That's the only time you'll hear me kind of get into it. All right, it's time to get started, everyone. If you weren't here Sunday, and if you were, you probably know we are in the book of Esther. So if you want to open up your Bibles to the book of Esther, we're going to pick up where we are for just a few minutes in Esther chapter 3, and then pick up in chapter 4. So quick summary of where we left off. Remember, we pointed out the importance of Mordecai being a Benjaminite. His grandfather or great-grandfather was Kish. It reminds us of King Saul. And in Ecclesiastes, in Esther 3 verse 1, we find out that Haman is an Agagite. And that would tie us with King Agag from 1 Samuel, I believe, 15, with the Amalekites. Remember the idea of history repeating itself of similar enemies toward one another. In Esther 2, after Vashti gets kicked out, he rounds up all the young virgins. And interesting enough, Mordecai tells Esther, hey, don't tell anyone else about your Jewishness. Let's keep that under wraps. Esther does win favor of the king. We talked about some of the moral questionings into there. Not only is she keeping her Jewishness a secret. Why? Okay, I guess that could be a good first question as we get our minds rolling here. Why, granted, Mordecai told her, why would keeping your Jewishness, her Jewish heritage, a secret, why would that be considered a bad thing? I understand from just my mind thinking of keeping her from being killed, but keeping her Jewishness secret, what spiritually speaking could be negative about that? Just one quick idea. Is having a secret the same as lying? Probably depends.
I was thinking more
Deceitful? Is secret the same as lying? Probably depends on here's a classic preacher word not used normally. It probably depends on the context there. The fun thing, there you go. Could be a podcast question. Remember that in Esther, God, in any shape, way, or form is never mentioned. We talked about the temple's never mentioned. We talked about how the law, the covenant, there's some hints. We've seen some hints at it, but God is very far from being brought up at all publicly in the book of Esther. So if you know in the ancient Near East, the Jews, you know the Jewish people's God, and the God of all we know is the Lord, Yahweh, all caps Lord. So she keeps that under wraps, and we talked about she's fornicated, she's married a pagan. Not that forgiveness is out of the realm, but that's not really the focus of the book. But also one quick thing on the timeline as we get started. If you look at Esther chapter 3, verse 7, talks about them casting lots. That's the first month, 12th year of King Xerxes or Ahasuerus' reign. And Esther 2, verse 16, when Esther is gathered with the virgins, that was 4 years or 5 years earlier, actually. That's the 10th month, 7th year. So it's been 5 years between Esther becoming queen and now Haman wanting to destroy the Jews. And so also in 3 verse 7, you'll notice they cast Pur. Probably some of you know the Jewish celebration Purim. It's going to be the end of the book. But that is they cast lots. Again, we talked about the idea of seeing God's providence in this story. Proverbs 16:33 says this, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from Yahweh. So again, if you have a Jewish perspective, and this book is written from a Jewish perspective, you see them casting lots, and you can't help but think the very way that they're trying to work is actually the thing that God is going to be using. And then very quick, wrapping up, because we very quickly read chapter 3, Haman has a 4-part charge against the Jewish people. But he doesn't tell the king who he wants to destroy. We talked about pride and one guy who disrespects him, he wants to blow it up to everyone. But if you look at verse 7, and I'm just going to paraphrase it here, but he says, look, these people who he doesn't name, who should be destroyed, they're scattered abroad. Not just in Susa. Remember, at the time, some Jews are headed back to Jerusalem at this time. You go read Ezra. So this isn't just like in the city. This is the empire. So there's my next question. What happens, I guess we could say, in the spiritual line of the Bible, theologically even, what would happen if the entirety of the Jewish people were wiped out? What would happen that would affect us today? as Christians of the 21st century. What'd you say? Okay, in theory, someone could have survived, but if the idea of what Haman happened, because if it's the whole kingdom, that would include Jews in Jerusalem, here, around. If all the Jews... Yeah, it's the whole empire. That's my point. Okay, so there we go. Now we're on. So recognize this is empire-wide. So there's no promises, Genesis 12:3, with Abraham of, the stars being the numbers of his people, and one coming from that will bless everyone. Or the promise to David, the messianic throne that will align forever. That affects us. Go read Matthew 1. That would affect us. But Haman here in chapter 3, starting in verse 7, says, these people are scattered abroad. Their laws are different from everyone else's. So that might be a hint at the law of Moses. Doesn't explicitly say it, but I don't think it'd be too far to say perhaps that's what we're hinting at. 3 says they don't obey the king's laws. 4, it just doesn't profit the king to tolerate them. And he tells the king, I'll pay you 10,000 talents. A talent is a weight. So scholars think this is roughly 300 tons of silver. Haman says, let me do this, I'll pay you 300 tons of silver. And by the way, that's roughly half of the annual tax revenue. So where on earth is Haman going to get this money to pay King Ahasuerus if he lets him do this? Where's he going to get it? Right, the Jews, they're going to plunder them. That's from plundering God's people. And we left off with the idea that Ahasuerus doesn't know who's going to be killed. The city has no idea what's going on. The palace doesn't know it. The city doesn't know what's going on. And Haman no one, as a matter of fact, even knows that Esther is a Jew. So let's pick up here in chapter 4 now. Mordecai. Verse 1, he learned all that had been done, and Mordecai tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He went to the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud, bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And every province, wherever the king's command and decree reach, empire-wide, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes, a common thing we read in the Bible, a very much so Jewish and just totality ancient Near Eastern custom upon mourning. And that's why he can't go into the king's palace. It'd be like rude or unclean or disrespectful for him to do that. So here's where it gets weird. I want to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts? Because verse 4, look at this. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, and Mordecai crying and all that, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. So Esther calls for Hathash, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn this and why it was. Why does Esther, or how does Esther not know that this decree has been sent out? That's pretty weird. Sheltered in the palace. Remember, there's a 5-year time gap we've had between 2:16 and 3:7. So here we are. It's been roughly 5 years since she's become queen. We're talking about her being sheltered. We're going to see that more. And let me see verse 6. So she sends the eunuch. Hathash goes to Mordecai to the open square of the city at the king's gate, and Mordecai told him, the eunuch, all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Verse 8, Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So we talked about perhaps Esther's, we've seen they're pretty much treated as property. I know she has some degree of authority, but still not a part of the decision-making process. But how did Mordecai find out? How does Mordecai find out here? Any theories on that? Just even here in the text, I just have a little bit, but I don't know 100% for sure. How would Mordecai know? How did Mordecai, great question to my question, how did Mordecai find out the exact sum of money Haman was offering Ahasuerus in the decree? And then he even mentioned he's in sackcloth and ashes. He's not even like he's in there. How did you find that out? Well, we talked about that last time. For some reason, he's always in the need to know circle. Saw that in chapter 2, saving the king's life. Did I see Carlton? So Carlton found the very easy answer that I was going to bring you all to. Smartest man in the room, perhaps. But if you read that along with verse 7 and 8, verse 7, he says, all that's happened to me, to him. And so everyone knows, as was pointed out first, we hit the nail on the head at first, Esther's inside the palace. We talked about how the palace is just ignorant of what's going on outside. So everyone's got the decree. He knows. He's heard about what's to go on. I still can't figure out exactly how he would know about the exact sum of money, but the important thing is he's seen the edict. Now, verse 8, if you look at the very end of verse 8, this is significant. He asks, hey, to go to the king, to Esther, plead with the king on behalf of her people. What's significant about that? Where he tells the eunuch to tell Esther to plead with him on behalf of her people. What's significant about this? She's been hiding. This is the first time as 5 years as queen, as far as we know, just from the text itself, that someone else knows she is a Jew. This is the first time it's out. It's just one eunuch, but it's out there now. Another thing I was noticing, actually, we didn't bring it up last time, what's funny is that Mordecai told Esther, keep your Jewishness a secret, but then when he defied Haman, they asked him why, and he told Haman's servants why he defied him. He said, it's because I'm a Jew. That was perplexing to me also. But anyway, here focusing in chapter 4, it's now out there. To some level degree, she's no longer a secret Jew. So we pick up in verse 9. Hathach goes and tells Esther what Mordecai has said. So she learns about this edict, the destruction of her people. Esther speaks to the eunuch. Hathach commands him to go back to Mordecai. Remember, they're not talking face to face. It says, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I've not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So this is pushing pretty much what we know as a month. Long time to not see the queen. So she's pretty hesitant to listen. And remember the relationship between these two. Technically they're cousins, but as we've read, Mordecai is the father figure to Esther. He's significantly older, and she's been following his lead, even though she is the queen. And just look throughout just historical writings, I thought it would be like a 50-50 shot if the king would let you in uninvited or not. Turns out no, and I guess it does match the biblical text as well. It was relatively rare for anyone to just show up uninvited, unannounced, and be like, let me in. And as she points out here, the sentence would be death. It's kind of like, how dare you think that you could just come and waste the king's time and just show up and disrespect the throne, even as the queen. And as we pointed out, even with Vashti, she was the queen, and she said no, and the king has ultimate authority in this culture. So verse 12, so here we see Esther's decision-making process, kind of. So they told Mordecai what Esther said. She said, I haven't been invited in a month. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And Esther told then to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights. And I and the young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it's against the law. If I perish, I perish. And Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Now there's a lot going on in here. A lot. First thing we'll point out is probably the thing everyone stood out, perhaps the most well-known verse. Esther 4, verse 12, Mordecai says, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Certainly, for those who believe in God, we are seeing his providence working here. That's what we talked about last time, not excusing anything or wrongdoing that perhaps that was done there, but God has set this up. Very clear. Now, what's interesting in verse 12 and 13, specifically 13, Mordecai says, you're going to die either way. Few options here. Is Mordecai threatening her? I'd find that surprising. Is this another hint at God? Is this saying that God will judge if you didn't do anything? Or perhaps is he stating that, well, the Jews will find out that a Jew could have perhaps saved them and they'll come and get you for it? Anyway, he's saying, whatever you do, it's just as dangerous for you not to say anything to the king. Either way you go. But what's really significant, especially when it has to do with the seasons of life, we're focusing particularly on Esther, after all, it's her book, but she's the younger one, Mordecai is the older. We're looking at this relationship here. So she agrees after Mordecai, the wiser, older one, saying, you've got to do this. She agrees, but she says in verse 16, as we've already read, to gather the Jews found in this city, that's Susa, to hold a fast on her behalf. So this is also interesting. Remember, this is written from a Jewish point of view. And once again, if we go back to, I believe, Esther 3, verse 7, we find out, if you know the Jewish calendar, the first month, Esther 3, verse 7, which is the month of Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, the edict, if you realize that in the calendar, is sent out on the eve of Passover. That's bizarre, because obviously we know Passover is a celebration of actually, ironically enough, deliverance from the Egyptians. And so, obviously, like we've said a million times, God's not mentioned here, but I have questions. She's saying on the eve of Passover to hold a fast. So, is this really important? Is that what she's saying? This is really, really important. We need to fast. And what's weird is prayer is not mentioned here. I think everywhere else in the Bible we get fasting and prayer, but here it's just fasting. But she's saying this is really important. Or is there the possibility that Esther doesn't even know or practices Passover? What do you guys think about that? Right. When the culture, same thing for us today in some principled sense, when the culture dictates what we think and believe, we'll forget the decrees of God. Yeah? They did not.
A lot of times, when you especially get a wicked king, so why would they observe them when they're under a foreign government?
That's part of the reason why they got sent in captivity. And God mentions things in the prophets of, you didn't take a Sabbath, I'll make you take a Sabbath. And kicks them on out of there. I saw a hand, Lyndall.
Chapter 3, verse 7 is interesting.
Yeah.
Whether Haman was aware of the event of Esther or Mordecai or specified duration where first month, third month, God had passed.
Right.
That first graph right now,
Mm-hmm.
it says it's 12 months.
Mm.
So it's come around to the sun. I think.
Yes, because we're pointing out, because remember, it's a large empire. It would take a long time to get from India all the way to Ethiopia. Remember, Ethiopia is south of Egypt, somewhere in that region. So it's taken that long to spread the decree. So they've got some time, like you're pointing out, and we're seeing the providence and inspiration of God. There's another hand, Carlton.
Vision of them reading the law out,
Mm-hmm.
how they react. They had gotten the law, and the reaction very strong.
Yeah.
It was made evident. On the law, very strong emotional response.
Yeah. So, fantastic point. That's twice. Stealing my stuff, man. I'm watching out for you. I'm not going to pick on you anymore. But that's twice. Really great point. If you read Ezra's roughly the same time period as this, if you couldn't hear him, he just pointed out they read the law there. And everyone realizes our forefathers, us, we've forgotten this. And their response is repentant, a heart touch, right? Just to change, and there's mourning there. So all that to come back to here of Esther asking for a fast on the eve of Passover. Again, can't be dogmatic about it, but I would personally go in the camp of perhaps she just doesn't know or maybe doesn't care to some degree. But it is interesting that they're going to fast instead of partake in Passover. And again, seeing providence and hints at God, fasting, you think prayer is not mentioned here. Very interesting. So now we've also noticed something else. Esther here kind of the roles have switched. What have you seen in a change in Esther from chapter 2 to now here toward the end or at the end of chapter 4? What has changed in Esther? She's roughly been queen for 5 years. What have you seen in her personal character development? Just in a few verses, but what has changed in her character? What have we seen that's different in her growth, perhaps? She seems more mature. How so? Uh-huh.
She's questioning the
Right.
but she's questioning.
Yeah, she's asking what to do and whatnot. Not being disrespectful to the older, to the wiser, but you pointed out she's no longer passive. And there is a time always, and there always will be a time for us to learn. But she goes from passivity to activity here. And it's interesting because in the seasons of life, we got someone much older than the younger, and he was telling her what to do, and she was obedient, and it was obviously under the working hand of God, because here we need Esther. But now we kind of see the younger, so the role switches to where she's kind of commanding the older. Not in a disrespectful way, but it's even more bizarre is obviously, the culture with it too. It's not only someone younger, but a woman. And I would go as far to say, not just politically, but even spiritually to some degree, because she says, ask everyone to have a fast, for everyone to fast. And we were pointing out a book devoid of speaking of God, that would direct us in thinking about praying. So she has changed a lot. And we see humility, bravery. She's identifying with her people. And obviously, clear connection for that today is we had better identify with God's people. She's a leader, in a sense. So that makes me think of our roles today. It's been brought up a bunch of times. I think it's 1 Timothy 4, where Paul tells Timothy, hey, don't let anyone look down on you just because you're youth. But at the same time, Timothy was listening to the wisdom of someone older. But why is it hard sometimes, but why is it often hard for the younger to listen to the older? Just one quick comment on that. Why do we find it sometimes hard when you're young to listen to the old person sit down and try and relate? I understand our pride can get in the way, but what might be something that gets in the way of listening to the older Tony? Think they know everything. That's right. I look back at myself just short 3 years or so ago, I'm like, wow. And I'm sure I'll look back at myself right now, not too long from now, and be like, wow, I'd imagine that's what'll happen. Any other ideas? Why is it hard for the younger to listen to the older sometimes? Margaret? Right. It's like you can't relate when they've been there. But so let's flip that question the other way. How can it be hard for an older person to listen to a younger person? Why might that be difficult? Sure, pride could be intertwined in all this. Yeah, you've got the experience. You've been there. You've seen it. Any other ideas? Why it might be harder for the older to listen to the younger? Assume the younger doesn't know anything, right? Sure, attitude's all tied into this. Yeah, I'm the older. I can never be wrong. The youth cannot be right. Again, this is not negating what we see in church leadership or anything like that. There's clear design for it. But there comes a time such as this. Did I see a hand back there? Yeah, Lionel?
If the relationship
Yeah.
as parent-child, it's difficult to acknowledge. At my time, telling someone,
Yeah. So if you're going to hear Lyndall and they're online or out here saying if he's the father figure, if you've been raising someone, my mom, you've probably all heard this old school term, I brought you into this world, I can take you out of this world type of mindset of who are you to speak and tell me what to do because you've always been their authority in raising them, but now there's a time for them to do their own thing. Provided it's, yes? Yeah?
I mean, you love them and you see it happen. You have to let it happen. I don't.
So the wisdom that I do not have was from one of our elders' wives. Renee is saying it's really hard to watch your kids make and let them make those mistakes. That can also be hard. It can be hard as the young, not just to listen, but it can be hard as a young person sometimes to follow the older. Since I don't agree with that or whatnot. Or for Mordecai here, it might have been hard for Mordecai to follow Esther's direction now. Like we've seen it switched, where Esther's saying, please do this, please fast. I think she's suggesting to pray, but please fast. And because verse 17, very clear, Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Very different change. The communication, that's where we're going. And communication goes better when I know they're family, but it goes so much better when we know each other. Right. How can we know about each other's lives if I'm not involved? How will I be able to assume the best with someone else if I don't know them? Very often, whether it's family squabbles, church squabbles, political squabbles, when we don't know the other person, we're very quick to demonize the other side. Very quick to do that. And here we see pretty healthy communication between a father figure, so to say, and age gap here. A lot of good comments. Any other thoughts or comments on this before we move on to chapter 5? I see a hand? Okay. Let's go on to chapter 5 here. So Esther's agreed. Remember, it's rare for the king to raise his scepter and allow someone uninvited to come in. So on the third day, classic biblical number, day 3, and the third day Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even a half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Quick stop right there. Do you think that King Ahasuerus is a bit surprised to see Esther? I would think so, because as we pointed out, just what's stated in the text and in history, it was pretty rare for the king to say, "Sure, come on in uninvited." And it's been a month, 30 days, as Esther told Mordecai, since he's even asked to see Queen Esther. But we see her really embracing, again, the maturity. Verse 1, her royal robes. Verse 2, it's Queen Esther. And verse 3 is asking, what is it? Why would you risk your life? It must be something important. And from King Xerxes' point of view, if she's willing to come in here and risk her life. Half the kingdom is probably just a royal exaggeration. But the reply in verse 4 is to come to a feast along with Haman. All right, what's going on here? Some people would say Esther chickened out. What do you think about that? Yay or nay? I think she's using good strategy too. Because if you notice here in verse 4, she says, "Come today to a feast that I have prepared." This is already in her mind. This is not like, "I don't know about this, back off." She says, "This feast is already prepared." She's clearly thought this through in that time of fasting. So I think it's very clear this is not some chickening out moment. So now we're going to see the first banquet here, verses 5 through 8. The king said, "Bring Haman quickly. He wants to please her, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. This is a plan. Verse 6. And as they were drinking wine, there's that again, after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What's your wish? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even a half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." And Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant me my wish to fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said." No details in the feast other than the usual, we're drinking again. And again, the same statement of half the kingdom. He knows she wants something. She's risked her life, You want something. He's kind of like, tell me, just tell me. And she says, verse 8, you come again, then I'll do as the king has said. Why do we suppose, because clearly she's thought this out. It's not, like we said, she's prepared this. Why do we think that Esther's saying, come again tomorrow? Why do you suppose? Just based on the reading of like verse 7 and 8, if I found favor in the sight of the king, if it pleases the king to grant my wish and to fulfill my request, have the king and Haman come to the feast, I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I'll do as the king has said. What's the thought? Kathy, you have a thought? She is setting Haman up. Yeah, we're going to see that here. That's exactly right. Kindling Haman's pride. Any other thoughts as to what she's telling the king here? Why would she have a second feast? Why not just bring forth the issue of her people being killed in feast number 1? Any other ideas? Ethan? Yes, I really think that. So Ethan's saying she's really putting an emphasis on that this is really important. I'm not asking for a new dress here. I'm not asking for anything like that. This is a big deal. I think maybe to paraphrase, she's telling the king this is a really, really hard request. If you're serious about helping me in something really difficult, really serious, if you're really serious about helping me out, then please come tomorrow to the banquet. And notice she's never blaming the king. She's very humble, very respectful. This is very much so well thought out. Very thought out. Thought over here. Chris?
I think, if I came to you and said, hey, Caleb, I've got something really important to tell you, but I'm going to tell you tomorrow. Like, what does that do to your mindset?
Makes me think.
You're thinking the whole time, what is he going to tell me about? Is it good? Is it bad? He's already said, I'll give you everything, half the kingdom, so is it something worse than that? Just take that. So I think it almost just speeds them up to like, okay, what is it? What's the interpretation of it? So, and then I think as we see, whenever he finds out what it is, maybe it wasn't as bad as what he thinks. Oh, that's all you wanted to do is just say, oh, okay.
Yeah, because he's offering her a lot. And that phrase, whatever it means, is that phrase of up to half the kingdom. And she's saying it's more serious than that, and making him think of what this could be to take it that seriously. Good point. Any other thoughts into what Esther's mindset is here? Okay, so as was pointed out with Haman, we talked a little bit about his pride last time and the lessons for us. So if we go down here to verse 9, Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself. He went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions in which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Verse 12, then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. In verse 13, the comedy of the book, yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. All right, well, quick pause right there. What about Mordecai's life changed when Esther invited him over to that dinner? I know long-term God's providence is working here, I get that. But just from Haman's perspective, what changed in his life in being invited to this meal as the king's top official, as if he's never had a meal with the king before? Kind of a trick question. What's changed? Nothing. Nothing has changed in his life. He's probably had a meal with the king before. This time the queen is there. He's a little bit of honor, and he thinks he's the greatest thing. Remember, we talked about that last time. When you're in your pride, anything great that you do or happens to you, we often magnify it because we think much of self. And anything bad happens to ourselves, or we'll magnify that because we think much of self. Because he's all happy, he's at the top of his game, and then in verse, 10? Verse 9, he sees Mordecai and he's filled with wrath. And up in verse 13, where he talks about Esther inviting him, then he says, "Yet all this is worth nothing to me, as long as I see Mordecai the Jew." Pride makes us think that our lives are either the greatest in the world or just absolutely worst in the world. That is what pride does. And really, we kind of see a pity party from Haman. He said, all these wonderful things king's done to me, me. I'm invited to this banquet. Verse 14, his wife Zeresh and all his friends, because he's gathered everyone to tell him about himself. He's lifted himself up. He says, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. This is what his wife's saying. And in the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. And this idea pleased Haman. And he had the gallows made. Remember, a gallows like a tree or a stick? Most likely this is just something to impale a person on. 50 cubits high, that's pretty real tall. Really wants to humiliate Mordecai. And in a narrative sense, it's just showing the great height of his anger, of his pride. Now, this is interesting. He's built up his ego. And note, let me find the verse here, verse 14, where the wife says, have the gallows. And in the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. What is significant, once again, what is significant about his wife saying to Haman, tell the king to hang Mordecai? What's significant about that? Think about it. What was Esther so scared of? She was afraid to lose her life, to come for a request uninvited. Do we see the picture here now a little more clearly? Some heads here going on perhaps. His wife is saying, command, tell the king to do this. Once again, just pride. I guess it's not just Haman. That's pretty bold. Just go tell the king what to do. Man. And all this has been circling around, again, with Esther's youth. We were talking about the good communication between someone older and younger, between Mordecai and Esther. And obviously, as it's been pointed out by you all, or y'all, that if we don't know each other and don't care about each other, and that if there's pride in the way, the communication between anyone, let alone a generation gap, is never going to happen. And I guess like Ephesians 5:21, before the passage we know better, Ephesians 5:22, wives submitting, but Ephesians 5:21 talks about submit to one another. I think humility would help us a lot there. How does pride, real open answer, looking for just some advice out there, how does pride get in the way when it comes to the unity of the body, when it comes to the unity of the church? How does pride get in the way? And there's a lot of answers to go with that, but sticking on theme here, how do you suppose pride gets in the way of the unity of the body of Christ? Yeah. Right. George pulled from that a little bit Sunday morning, 1 Cor 12, the unity of the body is being brought up there, that realizing the hand needs the eye and the eye needs the hand for me to pick up the phone or whatever. Because again, with pride, Haman's thinking here, pride just is going to think self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency. I can always do it better than someone else. Any other thoughts as to how pride can kill the unity amongst God's people? It causes division. Secondary issues become primary issues. Very much so true. What else? Yeah? Yep. Yeah. Being a servant. I'm going through, as most of you know, Philippians and Philippians 2 is just so amazing about what Jesus did. In depictions throughout history, if you just ask anyone who's not really religious or Christian, what would it look like if God came in the flesh? We're going to picture someone who's just going to invoke their power above everyone else. And yet that's not what Christ did. All right, we're going to pick up in Esther chapter 6. Haman thinks he can just tell the king whatever he wants him to do. They still don't know that Esther is Jewish. Thank you all for your comments and for your kind attention.